Hello and welcome back to Democracy in Lockdown. This is the third episode of the podcast. My name is Sam and I'm the campaigns officer here at Unlock Democracy.
My name's Trudy. I'm the Campaigns and Operations Officer at Unlock Democracy.
This is Democracy in Lockdown, a weekly virtual conversation on the latest news about the coronavirus crisis and what it means for our democracy. This podcast is presented by Unlock Democracy. We campaign for a better democracy and a new written constitution built and owned by the people.
So how's it going for you today, Trudy?
Yeah, good. Slow start as usual, but I'm feeling fine. Yourself?
Good to hear. Yeah, it's a bit too cold parts of the day, too warm in other parts, but other than that, pretty good. One thing I've been wondering about is whether people do different things under lockdown that you wouldn't expect to do. Like you'd expect to play more games or eat more food or do more cooking, but is there something you've been finding yourself doing more of because of a lockdown that you didn't expect?
Dishes.
Dishes.
I feel like I'm
Dishes.
constantly doing dishes because I'm eating at home all the time now, and also live with my partner. So I feel like I'm on this constant cycle of washing dishes that I just get up and every time I go to the kitchen, it's always a mess. But yeah, it's incredibly boring, but that's something I've noticed. What about yourself?
Yeah, no, I can relate to that. I've taken more of an interest in plants than I thought I had. So I've been obsessively trying to grow some tomatoes that some friends gave to me, but it's not working so well yet. But there's some herbs in the house as well that I'm watering. So that's just something I'm finding more time to do.
I definitely have been looking at some off potatoes and wondering if now is my time to get into potato farming, but
Cool.
live up to the stereotype. Last week we talked about civil liberties and policing powers, how they're being abused under lockdown and how they affect different communities in different ways. We spoke with Kevin Blow, who had some really great insights for that. So if you haven't listened to that episode, please do listen back. This week, we'll be talking about government scrutiny and accountability, why it's even more important in a crisis, and how the last few years have contributed to what we're seeing now. So some recent news items that have come up over the weekend. There's been a huge report in the Sunday Times at the weekend about the astonishing lack of action from the current government, where it was revealed Boris Johnson skipped 5 Cobra meetings on the virus. The order protective gear were ignored and scientists' warnings fell on deaf ears. The report states that the failings of February may have cost thousands of lives. There's also a mounting legal challenge about government treatment of prisoners in this time. There is a letter from lawyers acting from Howard League for Penal Reform and the Prisoner Reform Trust. It gives details of a proposed application for judicial review in relation to the Secretary of State's response to the obvious need to substantially reduce the prison population to save lives and avoid a public health catastrophe. There's also been our first protest over the coronavirus crisis, where a lone doctor has taken their PPE protest to Downing Street, and a review has been launched into the disproportionate impact on BAME communities in this current crisis.
Yeah, read that one too, and it's really important that's finally happening after all the piling evidence of that in the news. Okay, let's kick off. Today we're talking about accountability and transparency, and this is really one of the most important cornerstones of any democracy, in my view. It's how a society can influence the government between elections, and it gives voters critical information when deciding how to vote. So there's many forms that accountability and scrutiny can happen. So this takes place in the form of the media asking questions, of citizens protesting, and opposition politicians asking difficult questions. And in such a centralized system where there are a few key decision makers, this is even more important. But information is often not accessible at the right time. Opposition hasn't been able to ask questions in Parliament. Options for protesting by the public are very limited, while the media is owned by a few people, although it has started doing vital investigations into the government's response, as we've been hearing about this week. Today, MPs are approving a virtual Parliament, which will change that situation a little bit, but only 170 MPs will be able to participate in any one session, and there's no provision yet for online voting. So Trudy, there's been a number of crises piling up in terms of the government's response and questions being asked about their attitude to scrutiny. You've been looking into some of these examples, haven't you?
Yes, I have. So with The two major things that have come out of this crisis is the government's response on both PPE and testing. There have been a number of claims over the past 2 months. I would say 2 months, but more serious claims over the past month about them being slow to respond to the ongoing pressures of demand for tests. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a sort of rundown of the timeline, and a big shout out to the Byline Times, who have an incredible run-in calendar of events on their website, and to Stefan Smanowitz, who is also a journalist who is doing some very great long threads in terms of trying to make the government accountable for their past mistakes. So as early as the end of January, there was a meeting of 4 EU member states that said that the virus could require increased stocks in Europe of personal protective equipment, so PPE, such as gloves, masks, goggles, aprons, things like that. And the Commission said that it was ready to help if asked. The UK decided not to participate in any of the 4 EU procurement schemes to buy medical equipment in response to the coronavirus crisis. It's important to note here as well that the British government were not officially, but were pro-herd immunity from an early stage. And the first indication that this was government policy was on the 5th of March, where Boris Johnson floated the idea of herd immunity in an interview in This Morning. He said that one of the theories is that perhaps you could take it on the chin, take it all in one go, and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population without taking as many draconian measures. This was almost a month and a half ago. This sparked general outrage from medical professionals and the public, which forced them to slowly back down from the stance. By the 20th of March, at the same time that all the schools were closed alongside pubs and restaurants that evening, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jenny Harry, said that the country has a perfectly adequate supply of PPE and that supply pressures had now been completely resolved. And this kind of lay dormant until the start of April, where the PPE shortage row had started to escalate. So on the 2nd of April, Dr. Chan Nagpal, who is the chair of the Council of the British Medical Association, said that the doctors' union had heard concerns from physicians in more than 30 hospital trusts about protective equipment shortages. On the 3rd of April, in a joint press release, Chief Executive and General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing, Dame Donna Kinnairn, noted that I'm hearing from nurses who are treating patients in COVID-19 wards without any protection at all. At the same time, a British Medical Association survey of its members found that more than half of doctors working in high-risk environments said that there were either shortages or no supply of all adequate face masks, while 65% said that they did not have access to eye protection. And this is important because when somebody coughs, it can very, very easily get into the eyes. It not only is transmitted to your face or your hands where you can touch, but also that if it gets into your eyes, it can progress very rapidly. So on the 9th of April, a secret memo leaked to The Guardian stated that hospitals across England are running out of the surgical gowns needed to treat patients with COVID-19 and do not know when fresh supplies will arrive. It said that the memos contradict repeated assurance by ministers and the NHS bosses that they are getting on top of widespread shortages of PPE that have produced panic and fear among the frontline staff. So just a day later, Matt Hancock gave at the Daily Press briefing a statement of the talks of Herculean efforts and a new distribution network to ensure daily deliveries. In the same statement, he urged NHS staff not to overuse PPE, that we need everybody to treat PPE like the precious resource that it is. Now, this contradicts earlier claims that they had enough PPE to go around, and it's quite frankly shameful that he would inadvertently blame NHS staff for their own PPE shortages. This kind of attitude is something that we do see from politicians and had been reflected in Priti Patel's recent statement, where she said that she's sorry if we feel that there have been failings over the struggle to procure PPE for the NHS.
It's very sorry you were offended, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's in response to some very serious and worrying data that shows that NHS staff are dying from this virus. On the 12th of April, a report found that the UK government stockpiles containing protective equipment for healthcare workers in the event of a pandemic fell in value by almost 40% over the past 6 years. This analysis of official financial data suggested that 325 million was wiped off the value of the Department of Health and Social Care emergency stockpile, reducing it from 831 million in 2013 under the Conservative-led coalition government to 506 million by March last year. On the 17th of April, it emerged that NHS bosses have asked doctors and nurses to work without protective full-length gowns when treated COVID-19 patients, as hospitals came within hours of running out of supplies. This guidance is a reversal of the previous Public Health England guidelines. To move on to testing, on the 15th of April, Matt Hancock said in a daily briefing that they had committed to 10,000 tests by the end of March, which he says that they hit. Then they had previously committed to 25,000 tests by the end of April. He said that he would increase that goal to 100,000 by the end of April, so they would hit each of the goals that we set on testing. Now, the aim to do 25,000 tests a day within 4 weeks was first announced on the 18th of March. 4 weeks later, on 15th of April, 18,665 tests were performed, with 13,839 people tested. The number of tests has not surpassed 25,000 on any single day, meaning that the government has missed that target. The government could still meet its more vague mid to late April targets to achieve 25,000 tests per day, but Matt Hancock increased the goal for testing by the end of April to 100,000 on the same day. This is not looking hopeful because the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, commented that the Public Health England did not increase testing for quickly as was needed to control the spread of the virus. And these echo Chris Whitty's comments, who said a week ago that Germany got ahead in testing people for COVID-19 and that the UK needed to learn from that.
And I don't know if you saw, Trudy, this morning, but Open Democracy have also published a investigation saying that up to a quarter of the government's tests are actually not accurate, meaning that thousands of people could have been told that they haven't got coronavirus and then spread it since then, which I think just adds on to that really quite shocking culture of covering things up and just trying to win the media wars that this government seems to be doing with its approach to coronavirus.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of deep dive as well to be done into the whole herd immunity and whether there are some people that do speculate that there's still something in the back of the government's minds while they're making these decisions, and a few people have wrote on that, including Byline Times and Stefan Simanowicz, who I have mentioned earlier.
If you like this podcast, click the subscribe button and follow us on social media.
So we've just been talking a lot about how astonishing this response has been and the attitude to scrutiny and trying to stop information getting out and just not being level with people in any way. But I think this is really the logical conclusion of an attitude that's been developing across governments in the last few years, and it just seems to have got worse and worse. But now there's genuinely thousands of lives at stake. So it seems like this attitude is the logical conclusion of a government that just got away with this sort of stuff in the past, either when the stakes were lower or the victims of these decisions could be silenced or not be heard in the media, for example. There's been a big tendency since 2017 for the government to avoid scrutiny, and the Brexit situation and the timeline between the decision to leave the EU and it finally happening is full of examples like this that was really kicked off by Article 50 being triggered, where the government just tried to do it without a vote in Parliament and was then taken to court for that. So one example is the impact reports of the impact that Brexit would have on the economy and society that the government first refused to admit existed and then refused to publish. And actually, the government was held in contempt of Parliament for the first time ever for ignoring a vote in Parliament to publish these reports in full. That's not something that's happened previously. And there's just a litany of other examples about what happened in this period. So the Transport Secretary may have misled Parliament about the amount of money spent on the Seabourn ferry contract, which we've probably forgotten by now, but it was when £50 million was given to a ferry company, even though they didn't have any ferries and ended up never actually delivering a service to the government because it was a scenario planned for no deal Brexit. So that's 50 million just down the drain, and the Transport Secretary misled Parliament about that. The Brexit Secretary, as we said, misled MPs about the existence of Brexit impact reports. So he knowingly misled Parliament, and people would be expected to offer their resignation to the Prime Minister, usually in that case, the Cabinet Manual states. Another Brexit Secretary simply refused to give evidence to Parliament. Dominic Raab refused to do that and seemed to think that the rules didn't apply to him. The Work and Pension Secretary also lied about statistics to justify speeding up the universal credit rollout. Esther McVey breached the ministerial code by doing that. So this is just part of a culture that seems to have developed in the past few years in government, where it's not actually about solving the problem that you're dealing with. It's about whether you can get away with these things in the daily media war, basically.
Yeah, I definitely feel since monitoring here on Not Democracy, trying to keep up has been next to impossible. You also have Priti Patel, who's refused to give select committee evidence and has not shown up to many calls for that.
Absolutely. And there was a big delay to select committees actually meeting again after the election in December, which the previous chairs were really asking questions about. And, since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, this kind of attitude to dodging scrutiny has got quite a lot worse. So in the past, Theresa May was asking journalists to pre-submit questions to interviews, or just refusing access to certain outlets, or basically just trying to use the media as the government's own platform to deliver their message, rather than there being any kind of role for scrutiny or difficult questions being asked. But of course, until recently, Johnson's government wasn't even putting up ministers to speak on the Today Show on Radio 4, which is considered a really important way of how the news agenda is set for the day, and is really one of the only ways in which ministers are actually quizzed in detail by someone that's done a lot of research on the issues that they're talking about.
It almost seems that they're constantly redefining the limits there and slowly but surely normalising and contracting how much scrutiny can go past the government.
Absolutely. And it just seems like, even though there's howls of rage from people in the media or campaigners, the government is quite happy with the fact that as long as not enough marginal voters in certain seats are angry enough about this not to vote them back in, they can keep testing the limits of what they can get away with, and haven't found the limit yet to what they can get away with, which is really shocking.
Yeah.
So this whole thing to me just seems to be about media management and the management of communications, not about actual serious business of governing. So what this says for me is that we've got a huge concentration of power in the government in the UK. We're one of the most centralised states in the developed world. A lack of scrutiny and accountability has given people the feeling that the government is untouchable. So accountability is very weak in the UK, and ultimately the only power the public have to hold ultimate accountability is a general election, which gives the power to sack a government to only a handful of voters in marginal seats. If politicians could win over these people, they can basically get away with anything else. This isn't about individuals, it's about the system that incentivizes this behavior, and that's something that needs to change. So what should a healthy democracy look like? Should the public have more opportunities for a direct say in decisions? Should we be looking to examples in the United States, for example, where voters themselves can put policies to an initiative or a referendum? Should politicians be directly questioned by members of the public in a way that is controlled by an independent body, rather than at the People's Question Time, where the rules are basically set and filtered by the government?
Yeah, I think absolutely that there should be more channels for politicians to be scrutinised by the public. There's a clear lack of trust, and this has been recorded over many surveys in the past few years. The public do not trust politicians, and a way to do that, a way to reignite that trust, could be direct communication with the public. Something that the daily press briefings, however small that they are, is open up a channel for scrutiny by the public where they can actually see the timeline of what is happening in one individual case. And this could be, I wouldn't say that the government should do daily press briefings in general, but I think for big issues like Brexit, we should definitely be having more public scrutiny coming in. And definitely for example, whenever the Windrush Committee report came out, there should have been a briefing where the government was questioned.
Absolutely. And seeing these daily press conferences just reminds us really of how little these things happened in the past, and how it shouldn't feel novel to have this level of access to what the government is doing, but there we are. And Trudy, you said that lots of polling is saying that people don't have faith in politicians. If we opened up politicians to direct questioning by the public more, they'd at least hear more about the everyday experiences of ordinary people, not just about the rich donors or about the people in the same sort of circles that they're hanging out with. So that would at least increase the possibility that they'd make decisions that interest of the majority more than they often are these days. What do you think? Should people have more access to politicians than they do now? And what should a healthy democracy look like? Let us know by sending us a comment or on social media.
And do also let us know what would you like to hear in our next episode.
So I hope you've enjoyed this. Stand with us to transform democracy. And if you want to be the first to hear when new episodes come out, but also what we're doing in terms of our campaigns, sign up to get our email updates today. You can do that on unlockdemocracy.org.uk or follow a link in the comments.
Thank you very much for listening. Until next week.
Thanks, Judy. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll be coming back next Thursday with more. Remember, you can reach us on social media and tell us what you think we should discuss next week. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share. Stay home, stay safe.